So moving on to the conclusion now. So textbook evidence for Darwinian evolution are often distorted, exaggerated, or even faked. So my conclusion then is that, and inshallah, I'll try to wrap this up in a few slides, that there is no unequivocal evidence for Darwinian evolution, both at the level of pattern, which is the tree of life thinking, as well as the process, which is natural selection working on random mutations. So to claim that there is an overwhelming body of evidence that permits no other conclusion, which I quoted from the textbook by Odesek and Byers in the beginning of this lecture, is to do science dogmatically and not objectively. And universal common descent, which does not stand up to the challenge, as we've seen in this lecture, of scientific evidence, and neither does natural selection acting upon random variations solve the problem for tree thinking that is found with the neo-Darwinian model. So both of these are not facts. They are at best, speculative and conjectural. So to consider them as a fact of life is to do science extremely dogmatically. And that's one of the problems theology has with neo-Darwinian evolution, that neo-Darwinian evolution makes these assumptions and raises the epistemic value of these assumptions to a level of fact, which is the heart and the bone of contention here. And to point out that here the examples I've given, which are from textbooks, are not some isolated textbook errors. So you've got Haeckel's embryos, which have been around for about 150 years or even more. And the fake photos of peppered moths that are found in textbooks are found there from since 80s and 90s, so over 30 years. Homology concept, for example, has been around for over 100 years. So these are issues that are found in modern evolutionary and biology textbooks, which have been around long enough to be either taken out and rubbished, or to explained with at least some kind of disclaimer saying that these are theoretical models, but they are not factual in nature. So why is there a systematic pattern of exaggerating science to convince the students? Well, let's have a look at the textbooks I showed you in the beginning of the lecture. And this is the Odesek and Byers textbook. And in this textbook, you'll find the following statement on page 8 and 9. Over the course of human history, two approaches have been taken to study the life and the other natural phenomena. And what are those two approaches? Firstly, the first assumes that some events happen through the intervention of supernatural forces beyond our understanding. So you see kind of a sweeping statement there. It's beyond our understanding. We're not going to entertain it. We're not going to ascertain it because it's something that we can't understand. And they don't rest the claim at that level. The claim goes further into philosophy, which I'll come to in a minute. Here you have them continuing the statement as saying, in contrast, science adheres to the principle of natural causality. All events can be traced to natural causes that are potentially within our ability to comprehend. Now, the statement that all events, you can see here, all events, it's not saying events or some events or natural events. It's making a sweeping claim here. All events can be traced to natural causes that are potentially within our ability to comprehend. That's actually denying any supernatural whatsoever. So this is a statement about the nature of reality rather than a methodological naturalism. In other words, this is a philosophical statement. How? Because there are two problems in the statement that are philosophy related. When they say that all events can be traced to natural causes and they restrict the argument to natural causality, it does not say that science is methodologically limited to investigate events to natural causes. Rather, it portrays the natural causation as the only line of investigation that is objective, and rest of it is superfluous. And secondly, it does not say that science may not have access to the whole reality. So there's nothing in the statement clarifying that science cannot investigate the entire reality, therefore it's restricted to natural causality. A reader gets an impression from this type of statement that science can deal with everything. All events can be traced to natural causes. And that's where the problem lies. This is to say nature is all that is. There's nothing beyond nature. So that's excluding a supernatural from science, or from even a worldview that will be developed on science, because science should not permit it. And not just that, science will create a kind of method. In evolutionary science, the evolutionary scientists are creating a kind of methodology which forbids supernatural explanations even outside science, because it's saying all events can be traced to natural causes that are potentially within our ability to comprehend. So you cannot have an explanation which is based on supernatural causation, because if all events can be traced to only natural causation, then there is nothing left outside, there's nothing left to be explained, because everything, according to Oddersek and Oddersek bias, can be explained through natural causality. The statement passively makes a much stronger claim, which equates science with the view that the whole of reality is limited to natural causes. So you can see from here, all events, natural causality, and you can see here, supernatural has been, so here, supernatural forces are beyond our understanding. So it's a passive way of saying that the whole of reality is limited to natural causation. So this is philosophy. And yet we have this type of statements, lurking around in undergraduate as well as postgraduate textbooks pretending to be science. So here is a demarcation between the two types of naturalism, which you won't find in evolutionary textbooks explicitly, because they talk about methodological naturalism, but they smuggle in the metaphysical naturalistic statements, as you have seen in Oddersek bias book. So science or empirical sciences are primarily concerned with a naturalism methodologically, and that's the contemporary criteria set for science, although that's not be all and end all, because science will, the criteria, there is a demarcation problem between science and non-science. So I wouldn't put too much weight on that. However, in its contemporary criteria, the methodology in science is methodologically naturalistic, and philosophy deals with, and metaphysics as well deals with metaphysical naturalism. So Darwinian evolution is somewhere in the middle, and it pretends to be a worldview that is naturalistic, only dealing with natural causation. But in actuality, it's making claims about metaphysics, so it's metaphysical naturalism. So it's philosophy masquerading as natural science, which is the title of my talk. So Darwinism is not being clear about where it stands. Its pretensions and its actuality are misty. It's not clear. Here is someone who is a public promoter of Darwinism, and you can see from his statement how he conflates the two types of naturalism. Darwin made it possible to be an intellectually fulfilled atheist. What has Darwin got to do with atheism? Darwin was an atheist. He fluctuated at his most extreme fluctuations as an agnostic or a deist. He never promoted atheism. He never intended to write atheistically. That's what he himself said. Yet Richard Dawkins feels that Darwin's theory is an intellectual framework that allows atheists to be fulfilled. Now, people have the right to be intellectually fulfilled. That's not the point here. Whether theists or atheists, they have right to be intellectually fulfilled from whichever scientific theory they wish to be fulfilled from. And there is one anthropologist, a physical anthropologist in America, Eugenie Scott. She says that science is equal opportunity substratum for both theism and atheism. So it's not that people don't have the right to be intellectually fulfilled from science, whichever worldview they wish to erect, but they are not being clear that there is a demarcation between methodological naturalism, which science here you can see on the left side deals with in terms of its methodology, and metaphysical naturalism, which is an extension of scientific methodology into a philosophical worldview. And that's what Richard Dawkins is doing. He's conflating the two, and then he's proposing this to the masses as science, which it's not. It's an opinion of a scientist, but the actual statements he makes are not science itself. Those type of statements will not be peer-reviewed and published in science journals. You can't get, I mean, with the atheists, because of the secular worldview which the West lives under, and the hegemony of that, Richard Dawkins gets away, and his colleagues get away with a lot of atheistic agenda into the peer-reviewed literature, which a religious proponent will not be able to, will not be privileged to smuggle into the peer-reviewed papers. However, the kind of conflation that goes on here, you can see Darwin makes it possible to be fulfilled intellectual atheists. This is stretching science beyond its boundaries. And just like they have the right to be intellectually fulfilled atheists from Darwin's theory, from an interpretation that of evidence in their methodological framework, so too should a theist be allowed to be intellectually fulfilled theist from the same evidence and interpret the evidence according to a hierarchy of religious explanation. And no one has the right to teach students atheism in science classrooms. If you're blocked from teaching theism, then no one should be allowed to teach atheism. But I'll show you in another book, in just a couple of slides later, that atheism is passively being taught in science classrooms. And it's just that the word atheism is not used. Instead, blind is used, or unguided, or unsupervised, or those types of terms are used to do away with supernatural causation or supernatural intervention. And so why should someone have right to do that if a theist is not allowed to teach science, in science their theism? Likewise, atheists should not be allowed to teach these things in their classroom too. So here you have Campbell, Rees, and Mitchell in their 1999 book, Biology, and look what they have. The blind watchmaker is natural selection. So we're talking about blind watchmaker. This is Richard Dawkins' analogy in 1986 book, which he contrasted with Paley's argument. Paley argued that features of living organisms are designed just like the watch is designed, and this points to a designer. So he then has an analogy to that by saying it's a blind watchmaker rather than a designer who has made this watch. And this book, which is written by Campbell, Rees, and Mitchell, has 2 pages of interview of Richard Dawkins, who's known as a military atheist, militant atheist. And what you have is that students are being treated to this kind of metaphysical naturalism, and they're told that this is science. And not just that, students are also referred to Dawkins' book, which is The Blind Watchmaker, which is a book that's not a scientific book. It's a book based on mostly based on philosophy, with very little science. Some scientific arguments in its core, but majority of the assumptions are philosophical. So for Dawkins, it's a totally blind process. And then he goes on to saying, the statement in the Campbell, Rees and Mitchell goes on to say, natural selection is totally blind to the future. That's a philosophical statement about science, because science cannot make statements with such conclusiveness about future occurrences. How do we know that it's totally blind to future? What does future hold? Does science see that? Of course not. That's a philosophical wondering. And yet what it explains is the whole of life, the diversity of life, the complexity of life, the apparent design of life. Now, these are absolute statements, and you've seen from the three examples, Darwin's finches, and we spoke about the peppered moth, and we also spoke about the mutations, three mutations that led to the extra set of wings at the hull tiers of fruit flies. And all three of them were inadequate explanations to the process of natural selection. And even some of the textbooks agreed that there's controversy over the process of natural selection. Yet here, according to Richard Dawkins, the claim goes into absolute, and to becoming an absolute claim that the whole of life, the diversity of life, the complexity of life. So everything, there's nothing left of it that natural selection cannot explain. This is overpowering natural selection. This is being an extreme adaptationist. So why do we have this in a textbook? Textbook should be based on evidence, not based on Dawkins' philosophical views. And this is what students are treated with, because you have philosophy, you have Darwinism masquerading as science. You have metaphysical assumptions of Darwinism that is being pumped into the biology textbook. And it's only biology, it's only evolutionary biology that does it. Other science books like physics and chemistry, you won't find statements like that. They just deal with evidence and facts of science. It's only evolutionary biology that has to push the limits of evidence beyond its boundary and prove something that the evidence does not prove, and exaggerate it, and I've shown that even distort it at some instances. So this is a third textbook, which is, as I mentioned, postgraduate levels book, and this one is even more forthcoming with regards to the issue of metaphysical naturalism. So look what Douglas Futuyma says. Darwin made theological and spiritual explanations of the processes superfluous. So you can see here that this is a clear and explicit statement that is rejecting supernatural reality. So God has nothing to do with it. God is just meaningless. Why such a statement exists in science textbooks? These are statements of philosophy. These are not statements of science. And you can, as I mentioned, check up other textbooks. You won't find such statements in physics and chemistry. Or very rarely you find something of this nature. And all you find there is facts of science. Here, in evolutionary books, they start to make statements that are anti-religion. And they feel obliged to do that because, for some reason, to accept Darwinism means to reject God, according to the atheistic interpretations of neo-Darwinism. And I will conclude with this statement, which was written over 40 years ago by a theistic evolutionist, Theodosius Dobzhansky. And he was a neo-Darwinist and one of the architects behind the modern synthesis of evolution. And he was apparently a Orthodox Christian as well as a Darwinist, which I think is an oxymoron, because how do you reconcile Adam and Eve into into the Darwinian model, or vice versa? The special creation, Darwinian evolution has no room for special creation. Yet for some reason, Theodosius Dobzhansky was both, and he considered himself on the middle ground, theistic evolutionist, a radical one indeed. And he said nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. This was a title of his 1973, I believe, a paper he wrote in 1973. This was a title of his paper. And then in there he spoke about, you know, evolution being of great importance to biology, and evolution giving a historic explanation to the ahistoric day-to-day biology. And it seems that Dobzhansky over-exaggerated the statement, and to me as a scientist or any other scientist, it's probably more apt to say what Jonathan Wells has to say. He's an embryologist, PhD, and also a good scientist. And he puts things in better perspective. He says nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evidence. So instead of evolution, we should be working with the evidence. And that's how science should work. It should not be dogmatic, that evolution is taken for granted. Evolution also requires evidence, and as we've seen, neo-Darwinists insulate evolution as unfalsifiable. Tree of life hypothesis is considered almost as a biological axiom, self-evident truth that cannot be challenged. And it's considered as a periodic truth. So why is it like that? Why should the tree of life, and more recently, many evolutionary biologists have started to question the tree of life thinking. So many are not happy with it. There is a group of cladistics who call themselves, I think it's transformed cladistics. Yes, I think that's what it is. Transformed cladistics. They don't agree with the, in cladistics, they don't agree with the common ancestry as a starting assumption. So it's an insulated worldview, and strictly speaking, it doesn't fulfill the criteria of falsification because it's not open to falsification. It considers fact that you cannot challenge it. Anyone who speaks against the tree of life model is considered dissident in science, and sometimes ridiculed and even expelled, as one of the recent documentary showed that there are many scientists who have been troubled because of their rejection of Darwinian evolution. Now, if the textbook had stuck to evidence, as Jonathan Wells has explains, then they would stop believing in the statements of Dobzhansky, and they would be doing science, which is based on evidence. And what that will result in is metaphysical assumption of Darwinian theory would suddenly disappear, because those assumptions were not based on scientific evidence in the first place. So inshallah, I'll just conclude on that, and Subhanallah wa bihamdihi, subhanakallahumma wa bihamdika, ashhadu an la ilaha illa anta, astaghfiruka wa atubu ilayk.
Okay, any questions, just feel free to ask now, inshallah. Yeah. Yeah. Okay, so yeah, I've got your question. So your question is that the hybridization between big cats that I gave example earlier on at the family level, how does that common descent work in terms of evolutionary change? So what I need to mention here is that, if, say for example, if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala creates cats as one type of species, the big cats as one type, and then from there they start to diversify into different types, and it's not that they came from a universal common ancestor, they start diversifying in their structure. That much of a change in nature we can accept through mutations as well. So through mutations which have beneficial effects momentarily, but on the long run, we're going towards less state of fitness. So the argument I said from Professor Sanford, genetic entropy, that the ultimately, there is actually a hadith of Prophet ﷺ which talks about Adam alayhi salatu being 60 cumulative and his zurriyat are starting to decrease in size. Without going into the actual hadith aspect and what the muhaddithin say, if we take that hadith, what we get from that, one understanding that I understand from that, is that change in size is a degeneration. So that's what we are getting. We're getting changes in form that's going towards less state of fitness rather than more, higher state of fitness. That puts Darwin's tree of life upside down, because you got more complex followed by the less complex. Whereas in Darwin's tree of life, we've got less complex followed by more complex. And that's what Darwinists have to prove. So the original cat would be more complex, and then as time goes by, there's less complexity. That's one way of looking at it, from the argument that I presented in today's lecture from the Sanford, and neutral mutations are more tilted towards deleterious mutations. But if you accept that there are beneficial mutations, then I mentioned that the genetic antagonistic entropy, where the genome will shrink to focus on one beneficial trait, but then you're losing a lot of other beneficial aspects of the organism.